Hello YouTube, I'm Clare Pollard, I'm a poet, and this is the first meeting of Clare's Poetry Circle. So, to begin with, I'd just like you to take a moment to ask yourself, what is poetry? What draws you to the idea of poetry in particular? How is it different from other types of writing? Now, if you have a pen and paper with you, you might want to write down some of the words that come to mind. There's no wrong answers. It's just to make you think a bit about, what is this genre? Pause the video if you like. Okay, so you're just thinking, how do I recognise a poem? What does poetry mean to me? Now, let me talk you through some of the answers that my students usually give me. Well, rhyme is one, obviously. Let's confront that one straight away. Of course, contemporary poetry doesn't always rhyme, and it certainly doesn't have to rhyme. And it's a myth that in the olden days, traditionally poetry rhymed. Paradise Lost by Milton is written in blank verse. Milton said rhyme was newfangled. Wordsworth's Prelude doesn't rhyme. But rhyme is not a wrong answer because it's certainly a way of recognising a poem. You know, it's not prose. And poets should be alert, I think, always alert to the way words echo and chime off each other. Rhythm is another answer people give. On stronger ground. Most types of poetry, most forms, wherever they're from in the world, feature some kind of attention to rhythm, by which we're usually talking about the organisation of stresses. Obviously, you don't get stresses, though, in syllabic forms in the same way, like haiku. Ezra Pound said of imagism, when modernism was happening, they were writing free verse. We're no longer going to compose poetry like a metronome, tick-tock, tick-tock. But it should still be like a musical phrase. That is, you should still listen to the rhythm, even if it's not regular. The easiest way to get in the habit of incorporating rhythm into your poetry is always to read it aloud, which I'd highly recommend. It's probably the biggest tip I have. Always, when you start writing poetry, start reading it aloud. It's an oral art form at its roots. And you'll start to hear where things are clumsy. You'll start to hear where things don't flow. Other types of music my students might mention that poetry makes them think of: alliteration or assonance. The repetition of an S or hissing through a poem, or a T can have a musical effect. Early kind of English Anglo-Saxon poetry is actually structured around alliteration, as is contemporary poetry traditions like the Somalian poetry tradition. So alliteration and assonance. Repetition is another musical effect often used in poetry. Starting each line in the same way, that's called anaphora. It's a rhetorical device. That's often used in list poems. Or ending lines or couplets with the same words. That's what you would do in a ghazal. I'm not sure, I never know how to say that. Or a sestina. They use the same end words in each verse. So repetition. And also refrains, repeating whole lines. You'd have that maybe in a ballad. So there's lots of musical devices. And what you have to remember is all these are mnemonic devices. They're all memory devices. And they relate to something important about poetry, its oral roots. Don Patterson has a great line. A poem is a machine for remembering itself. I think that's something we should keep in mind over the next few weeks. What else? Well, poetry is also actually visual. So if I hold up now a poem for you, you can't read it from over there, but you know that's a poem. Why is that? Well, one thing is lineation, line breaks. The lines don't go to the edge of the page, they stop. Another thing is stanza breaks. Rather than paragraphs, poems are often written in stanzas. So you can see, just by looking at it from a distance, you can recognise it's a poem. And line breaks and stanza breaks are part of the music. I always read them aloud when I read my poems. You can hear my line breaks and stanza breaks. But they also have a visual effect. Some poets have taken that further and arranged their poems into shapes. Mushroom cloud, wings in George Herbert's famous Easter wings. I've got my own concrete poem in Changeling, my book Changeling. The whale's tail, which is a nod to Herbert's Easter wings, and the mouse's tail in Alice in Wonderland. So, you know, concrete poetry is also a thing, but poetry generally is just visual. We have white space to play with, okay? And before you even read a poem, we have an impression of it. We're starting to get information before we even start to read the words. Is it a skinny, delicate looking little poem? Is it organised into a formal pattern? Is it a big, chunky, long-lined epic like a Ginsberg poem? You know, the way you lay it out can convey a lot of information before you even start to read. Another thing you might see about poems, another reason you might recognise things are poems, is brevity. Some people might say that's a quality of poetry, that poems are short. I have here a prose poem. My poem, The Oil, is a prose poem. But even though it's written in prose, it's not lineated, it's not got stanza breaks, it's not really using white space. You'd probably still guess even from a distance that that's a poem because it's short. And we know poetry is great at doing short, you know. It fits on a tweet sometimes, right? If it's on an Instagram photo. That's not always the case. There are epic poems, but one way you might recognise a poem is brevity. Now, if you're cramming lots of sound effects and visual effects into an often very small unit of language, that leads to another thing people say about poetry. It's just kind of more. It has a kind of intensity. It requires a different sort of attention to other writing. It's concentrated. Every word counts, every comma counts even. Coleridge has that great line, the best words in the best order. What else might you have written down? Well, people often talk about imagery and metaphor as being something they associate with poetry. And that kind of follows on because, of course, novelists do use imagery and metaphor too. But I think people are saying something about the type of attention, the intensity that poetry demands. If you put an apple in a novel, it's just an apple someone's eating usually. Whereas if you put that apple in a poem, suddenly, oh, everyone says that's sin, it's temptation. It takes on this metaphorical resonance where it can't just be an apple. I always tell my students, be extremely careful about putting sausages in poems. And then we have, people often say they like poetry because it's emotional. And again, well, novels are emotional too. But there is something, I think, true that people are getting at there. We do reach for poems, don't we, at weddings, funerals, births, those emotional moments in our lives. I first became a poet, I suppose, as a teenager who was very depressed, and I was writing to process things. We write it to process things, we read it to process things. And poetry can distill emotion, I think, in a way I would argue few other genres do. There are poems I can read that make me cry within about 2 or 3 lines, you know? Just a few seconds, a few words. Poetry can escalate that fast. A novel, no offence novelist, it usually takes me about 200 pages before I get into the mind space to start crying. So I think poetry does have that emotional depth charge. Now, all these, they're not rules, I've said, I don't really like rules, but all these ways of recognising a poem, of course, they don't always apply. There are unemotional, unlineated, baggy, unrhythmic poems out there. Another definition would just be a poem is what you say is a poem. I found poetry is certainly like that. But I wanted to just mention some of the things we're going to be looking at in our poetry circle over the next few weeks. Okay, now I've promised you an exercise each week, which is probably what a lot of you are here for. I spoke earlier about list poems. I like list poems. They're easy to write and they use repetition to kind of accumulate power as they go along. It's one of the oldest forms there is. Often in poetry workshops, what people do is use an existing poem as a model. And 2 I've used in the past with my class are list poems. Joe Brainard's poem I Remember is amazing. A lot of you might know it. Every line just begins I remember. So for example, I remember butter and sugar sandwiches, or I remember when beehives got really out of hand, talking about the hairdos. And it manages to kind of build up a picture of a person and an era from these moments and these images. It's incredibly powerful. There's a poem by Helen Dunmore I like to use too in classes called Glad of These Times. And a lot of the lines begin glad of. So she says she's glad of smart cards, or glad of 20 types of yogurt. That's a great line. Glad of cheap flights to Prague. It's a really surprising poem, I think. We're so used to reading depressing poems about the state of the world. Goodness, I write a few of those myself. But she reminds us of our blessings. So I'd recommend you seek that out. So I've decided I'd like you all to write a poem, and a list of poems is a simple way to start. And I want you to write a list poem for this pandemic year. So I'd like you to give it a title like that pins the moment. So something like 2020, the year of the pandemic, the new normal. You know, think of your own, but the title should place it in this here and now. And we've been talking about poetry as a kind of paying of attention, an intense attention. So I'd like you to begin each line of your poem with the words, I noticed. What have you noticed this year? It could be wider news events, things in politics, things that made you anxious. It could be that you noticed hand washing and coughing and stuff a lot more. It could be about the passing of time. You noticed it was flowing differently. It could be about domestic things. Perhaps you noticed, you know, how much mess your kids made, or how dependent your husband is on coffee. I don't know. It could be that you noticed the flowers in your garden. Certainly on my Instagram feed, a lot of people seem to have been noticing nature. It could be about people, about how your neighbours behaved. Anything, good or bad. What did you notice this year? But my one tip is to make it really specific. Just putting that out there, okay? Don't say, I noticed flowers. That's a bit, well, it could work. It could work. But if all your lines were like that, it would be a bit boring, a bit general. We'd go, well, yeah, so did everyone, you know. If you say, I noticed the wisteria on Peckham Rye, that's much more specific. If you then describe the exact colour of the wisteria, that's maybe even better yet. Poets are often afraid of being specific when they start out, because they feel like they should write something universal that speaks to everyone. But actually, the more specific you are, weirdly, the more this poem is going to resonate with other people. So that's your exercise. Very good luck. And please share your poems. Hashtag Clare's Poetry Circle. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Poet Clare. There's no I in Clare. And I'll be checking the comments here at YouTube too. And I'm not on Facebook. I don't really care for them. But if you wanted to share stuff on Facebook too, that's great. But just to let you know, I won't be able to look at that. But do tell your friends about these workshops. Spread the word. If you're in a poetry group or a writing group or stanza group, spread the word. And have a good week. And I will see you here next Monday. Bye.